Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion titled What Policing Reveals About the Possibility of Development. I'm Kalista, the Vice President, External Relations at the Oxford Development Consultancy. The ODC is a student-run consultancy at the University of Oxford, providing pro bono research and consulting services to NGOs, development, and microfinance institutions. The ODC Symposium is our inaugural initiative to facilitate important conversations on international development by reaching beyond the Oxford student body. We have a 4-week program including discussion panels, talks, and networking events. We're also pleased to announce that in collaboration with the UNHCR, the ODC will be hosting an essay contest in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's an excellent opportunity for all who are interested in discussing these issues, and you'll get the chance to have your work featured on UNHCR platforms. More details about the competition can be found on LinkedIn or Facebook. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Graham Denyer Willis, Senior Lecturer in Development and Latin American Studies in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. The session will open with his lecture on the subject before moving into a moderated discussion where we'll take any questions from the audience. Please submit any questions that you have for Dr. Denyer Willis in the chat. If you wish to participate in group discussions later on, please stay after the end of the lecture and we'll sort you into breakout rooms. So now, with all the administrative information out of the way, Dr. Denyer Willis, would you like to introduce yourself and begin your lecture?
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation to come and speak about some of these questions about policing, development, and the way that we should be thinking about how security matters in our lives and in the lives of people in the global south, but also in the world more broadly. I'm going to share my screen here and just work through some ideas. So give me 1 second. Okay, excellent. Very good. So I assume you can see that okay there. Now, just a quick word about myself. Yes, I'm a senior lecturer in politics, development studies, and Latin American studies at the University of Cambridge. By methodological training and epistemology, I'm an ethnographer. So what that means is I spend long periods of time alongside particular groups of people to understand the ways that the logics of life play out, how decisions are made, the assumptions and the politics of the everyday are a really central part of how I think about problems in the world. So the question of policing for me and of development is then a kind of ethnographic question. It's a question of how does policing play out in an everyday way on the world, on the streets, in the ways that police themselves experience citizens and how citizens themselves also experience police. And placing that, especially in the context of Brazil, São Paulo, where my first book was based on 3 years of ethnographic research alongside homicide and other detectives in the city, to try to get a good sense of how does police work, and especially homicide investigation work, in the context of a mega city experiencing both a dramatic decrease in homicides, but also a really prominent rise in a particular organized crime group. So this is an image here that you can see that I took during field work from a homicide scene where I was with homicide detectives to try to get a sense or to depict a little bit of what it might look like on the street, right, for these people. So that's my starting point to try to think about this question. What I'm going to talk about today specifically is the relationship between policing and development. Two things, ideas, right, that sometimes are in tension, sometimes we want to say are a part of the same project. And what I'd like to work through today is some thinking about how we might need to critically address this problem of the relationship between policing and development and whether they are complementary, antagonistic, in tension, and how we might make some inroads in thinking about this relationship. So I'm going to approach that by thinking and discussing 3 strands. The first is, how do we think about the tensions that surround policing, right? There's a lot of violence that surrounds policing. There's racism that surrounds policing. There are minority questions. There are big concerns about who police are defending and who they do not defend, right? That all begs us for a particular definition of what policing is, right? How do we define it? How do we think about where the limits of it are? Is it a question of an institution? Is it a question of a system? Is it a historical question? Is it a political question? Is it an everyday data kind of question? All of those things are in the air to be considered, right? The second strand that I'm going to discuss is a little bit about what development is, right? What do we define development to be, and how does that matter relative to the way that we might be thinking about what policing is and what it does, right? I'm going to approach that question today from a kind of a particular location in Latin America around the idea of the pink tide, right? That there was a moment, a historical moment of government and of democracy where we saw some center-left governments emerging with what we often associate with progressive policies, right? So we had a moment in which there seemed to be gains emerging in livelihoods, in the quality of life, in many of the metrics that we associate with development. So we're going to work through that. The third is then to think about how those two things fit together, right? How does development as it happened in the pink tide, or in a particular case of the pink tide like Brazil, intersect with questions of policing and the provision of security, right? What was the relationship, or what is the relationship between the logics of development that occurred in the pink tide in Brazil, for example, alongside questions of public security, policing on the street, and how that all happens, right? And then I'm going to transition towards the end to something of a bit of a conjecture, right? If we are to think about development as freedom, as Marta Sen has often written, what if we ask ourselves if there's the possibility of freedom with police, right? Police are there to assert order. They're there to maintain a status quo, as some scholarship holds. What does it mean then to have freedom if we still have that as a condition in our life? So the first question here, this is an image that I took while with police in the city of São Paulo on the south side of the city. And what you see, of course, in the foreground is a differentiation, right, between two different kinds of space and of logics and of development, right? On the one hand, informal housing, which is very ticky-tacky, bricolage over a hillside. On the other hand, a redeveloped effort, right, to create better urban housing that is overseeing, that has reproduced or been recreated over top of the way that urbanization happened. Now, when we're thinking about policing, what are the stakes of defining it in a particular way, right? For scholars, there are lots of different ways to say how policing matters and how we should think about it, right? For anthropologists and many ethnographers, policing is simply a question of maintaining the status quo, right? It's of keeping order, people in place, asserting things through a bureaucracy, doing investigations that follow a kind of line that is understood, right, as what is normal in life or what is normal in a condition. Whether that is about law or about a law in practice, right, versus law in the books is a different sort of question, right? For Marxists, policing is a question of the maintenance of capitalist relations. It is essentially the borderline, the policing of the borderline between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? Or those who provide labor and those who use labor. And it reproduces that relationship such that the inequities that exist between those who have value and can accrue value and those who work as labor and whose value is used is maintained, right, in a particularly inequitable kind of condition, right? So the implications of that, of course, then are that you have to get rid of police to be able to, right, transcend those kinds of questions of inequality. For criminologists, especially more positivist criminologists, policing can be a question of data, of everyday kinds of practice, of particular kinds of discrete interventions like hotspots, right? We can find out where crime happens in time and space, we can map it, and then we can create particular kinds of interventions into that location, right? To actively interact and try to have an impact in a discrete way on the way that crime as something that exists kind of objectively in the world for them is destabilized, right? For social and political theory, people like Foucault and others, policing is not just a question of an institution, right? People with uniforms and driving around in cars and who wear badges and have guns, but it's also a question of a larger system, right? That we police ourselves. And so the police work of a car and a uniform is a part of a larger maintenance of a system, but it is in itself not sufficient to maintain order in an everyday kind of way. For others, like Max Weber, it's a question of the monopoly on violence, right? That the police are the people who are upholding the superiority of the state and its authority over the uses of violence as a condition of politics, right? So all of these things, and we could go on and on and on, understand police in different kinds of ways. They provide different starting points, different assumptions, and then of course, different implications for what we should do about policing, right? How do we, as people who want to change the world, believe that things can get better, that living conditions can improve, that violence can be reduced? How do we intervene is always then a kind of implication of setting aside one particular perspective about policing and embracing another one, right? Now, of course, alongside that, there is a larger question of practice, right? So not in questions of scholarship, but in questions of actual pragmatic existence in the world, police are an institution, right? They are funded by tax dollars, they exist in buildings, they drive cars, they have guns, they can use violence, they can arrest people, right? And all of that is very much a question of practice. It could be as much about how it happens in a place like this in São Paulo as it could be in Cambridge, as it could be in New York City, as it could be in Nairobi or Johannesburg or whatever the case is, right? So there is an everyday practice where someone sits down and after a homicide, they write down a report and they have to tally it down, text in boxes, what did it look like, who's the victim, all of that kind of stuff gets put into a bureaucracy. And that itself is an important set of considerations, right? If we want to improve the way that policing works, we have to attend ourselves to what practice looks like. Now, there are other kinds of important questions too about the stakes of thinking about this, right? So this is an image that comes from South Africa about a particular kind of effort to intervene or create change in the ways that citizens interact with police, right? Surprises probably very few of you that many police organizations around the world are not trusted by people, right? That people, if they are robbed on the street or if they suffer violence or if they encounter a particular problem, that they're reticent to call the police because what people say about police or their own experiences with police, or they have a sense that if they call the police, they're just as likely the police will come and extort them as they'll actually solve the problem, right? So there are efforts in the ways that people are trying to iterate policing that seek to bring police closer to communities, right? To make policing about the community. The community is driving the police and not the police being a sort of top-down authoritative institution, right? Working upon the community. Now, these are important questions that really bring to bear different kinds of questions, different kinds of normative assumptions about what we should think about the police as doing in the context of development, right? Both in the kind of contemporary moment, the now, but also in the way we would think about what development means in a historical sense, right? That police have not always existed. In fact, as an institution, they're quite new, right? They were created in the 19th century in the United Kingdom in the institutional form that we know, used and changed in their relationship to colonial powers, right? So development of policing in Ireland became important for the use of policing in England, and then of course was colonized and sent out as a kind of packet in the way that colonization happened around the world, which is why we see such institutional similarities in the way that policing happens in the Indian subcontinent, in Latin America, in Africa, and the kinds of ideas and logics, the badges, the techniques, the fingerprinting, right? All of that has very peculiar and interesting global techniques and patterns of knowledge that have changed over time, right? So in history, policing is something that's actually quite new. And whether we see policing in a kind of discrete moment, it's a now, it's a particular set of patterns that have become important in the last 20 years, or if we see policing as something that has existed over, the last 120 years, and with its own distinctive kind of patterns in different countries, is a key part of this question. How far are we willing to go back, and what does it reveal to us if we go back really far, right? In terms of why they emerged and how. Excellent. Now I want to turn to some of the questions about development now, right? So we've got interesting and important questions about policing, and now we want to think a little bit about development, right? So what is development? For those of you who have been studying it actively, you'll know that there are many different debates about what development is, who gets to define it, how it happens, what are the metrics we use to measure it, what are the policies that have become really important over time, what's the role of the market versus what's the role of the state, right? All of these are important considerations for thinking about what development is, right? For scholarship, of course, there are kind of hegemonic notions of what development is and how it's measured, right? So we think an awful lot about GDP, we think about growth, we think about industry, industrialization, we think about supply chains. All of these are big questions that are actively being debated in global context, right? How to ameliorate inequalities that exist in global terms, but also in intranational terms, right, within states themselves, right? And often there's very little agreement. I mean, there are ways in which there are common assumptions, right, that often the market is seen as that which must be central to the way that livelihoods are improved, right, through things like jobs, the creation of employment, and that sort of thing is often held as a kind of common good, a sort of assumption that must be good for everybody. Of course, there are other scholars who would say that development is really none of these questions. Development is a question of human emancipation. It's a question of allowing people to make decisions in their own lives, to be able to experience and grow and nurture themselves, right? Others who would say development is a question actually of subjective logics, right? How do we have happiness indexes to describe how a person whose own development should be measured relative to how they're feeling, to their sensibilities, to the way that they feel fulfillment in the world, right, has become a key question here. Then, of course, for Marxists, this is a question of the ways that global inequality has expanded, right, or changed over time as a result of globalization, the uses of commodities, the development of commodities, the consumption of commodities in one part of the world and their transfer across space and in time, right? The way accumulation happens and allows for reproduction of accumulation to continue, right? Such that new industries can grow. And all of that, of course, is asking for a bigger, more historical sort of consideration. Now, there are, of course, in development questions of practice too, right? Well, how do we think about development in practice, right? Are there particular policy questions that are really important here, right? How do we intervene, right? If we are people who want to make the world a better place, how do we intervene to make a particular positive change, right? What are the things that we define as positive when we do that? And how are there particular ideas about the ways that practice can happen, right? That define what is feasible, what is not feasible, right? The budget becomes a big question here, right? That we have fixed amounts to spend. And so how do we justify things? And expenditure becomes something that's really central to what is possible, right? The logic and practice of development then can be split in at least two different kinds of ways, right? On the one hand, it can be a question of de facto practice, right? There are institutions in the world who are actively investing, using capital to change industries, to create new markets, to develop new innovations that can create jobs in particular kinds of ways that wouldn't describe themselves as development actors, right? They might talk about national development or growth or economic growth or the way that industry needs to expand, that jobs are important, the creation of wealth, et cetera, right? Not so much a development studies sort of question, but definitely a question of like of development. It's the way the world is changing constantly, right? With some actors very central to that logic and others a little less so, right? On the other hand, we of course have particular institutions in development, right, who describe themselves as development institutions. They are actively and by mandate involved in deciding who it is that should be intervened upon, what kinds of problems exist in the world that need to be addressed, how does a particular problem get framed as a problem of development, right? And what are the responses to that that might come in the way that people develop solutions, right? Again, perhaps nudge type politics, perhaps hand washing, right, to get rid of bugs, bacteria, things like that. But can also be a question of infrastructure, street lights, right? How does somebody actually create the questions that allow for foundations for other kinds of growth to move on, right? Of course, surrounding all that, we get bigger sorts of questions about things like the Washington Consensus. What's the role of power in practice, in the practice of developments, and how these things happen, right? Who enables particular questions of development practice to be asked, and what questions are crowded out of that question, out of that concern, right? How does that itself get shaped as, that's a legitimate question to ask about development, while a question that says, well, what about the people who have accumulated value over time? What's the role of slavery here, right? What's the role of history in the ways that some populations and race matter in how they are addressed by the state or neglected by the state, right? So there are big questions that are left out sometimes that we should reflect on constantly, even when we're thinking about what practice looks like, right? Now, this image here that I have is a graph. It comes from a recent paper. And the reason I have this graph here is that it's showing one particularly common and often much celebrated kind of development intervention and practice, right? And that is the conditional cash transfer, right? The conditional cash transfer being this idea that a government can help to improve life circumstances, conditions, health outcomes, education outcomes by providing cash directly to citizens, right? Money into their pockets so that they can spend in ways that they desire, to get better food on the table, right? To allow their children to go to school, that is tied to particular kinds of conditionalities, right? That you get the money if you can show or demonstrate that your children are in school. You get the money as long as you can show that you don't have a criminal record, right? Things like that allow the government to give some leeway to people, but also recognizing that sometimes the money is what matters, right? People have to have the money to buy the food, to be able to eat it, right? And sustenance allows for a lot of the really basic subsidiary questions to be addressed, right? So in this image, we have, of course, a really dramatic growth over time from 1996 until 2014, and then a slight decline, right? But what we see here is a rapid uptake of the idea of giving cash to the poor, largely, because there are conditionalities on who can get it and why and how, as a very popular means to solve some of the big questions of development, right? Now, this is a Latin America question here, so you can have a decent sense of the kinds of programs that might matter, right? There's a number of them across different countries. In this paper, which you can find, I think there's at least there's a paper on ResearchGate. The paper is on ResearchGate, and different graphs that show different countries and how they have expended money in these CCTs over time. But this is really key because it's showing a dramatic rise. There's almost a consensus emerging here that this is an interesting and feasible way to try to solve some of the problems of development, right? Now, I want to point out something here that I think really does matter, right? And that is that on the one axis we have percentage of GDP, right? Now there's a comma there, and what in English we would say is a period. But what you see is that we're talking about really tiny proportions of gross domestic product here, right? I mean, up until 2014, we're still talking about it's percentages, average percentage of GDP being only less than well, around a third right, of 1% of GDP. It's a tiny amount in the scope of what the kinds of expenditures that are happening on other kinds of things. So it's not a lot of money, right? And of course, that makes it feasible, makes it easy. It's easy to think about in terms of how you can spend it, right? It's not going to impact in big ways on the way that the state might spend money on other kinds of things, right? So that's a key kind of question, right? So this is a key, deliberate, discrete way to address problems of the poor, largely, with a limited amount of money and in ways that people have shown have good or helpful impacts, right? But it's not a lot of money, right? Good. Now let's move on to think about how this might matter in other ways, right? Other kinds of development interventions. Now, hey, this is in Portuguese, so I don't know how many people can read Portuguese, but I'll help you interpret it here. This is from a recent report, 2018, which is talking about the finance and politics of security in Brazil, right? And what they're saying here is that in 2017, 84.7 billion Brazilian reais, which is around 1.2 billion US dollars, were spent on security, right? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. But how does that compare to conditional cash transfers? Well, if you look down and next in the dark green section there, what you'll see is that it says Brazil spends 408 reais per citizen on public security, which is 1.3% of GDP, right? So the costs of security are 1.3%, but the cost of a conditional cash transfer or something that addresses the emancipatory questions of the urban poor gets something like, 0.2 of 1% of GDP, right? So there's a very different kind of logic of what can be justified, what should be justified in terms of what states do in security, policing, and things like that, versus what is done for human livelihood, right? And I want to make that distinction. I'm going to pull it out a bit more here, right? What you'll also see here is that this is rising in general. So the amount of expenditure is going up. 2017 in Brazil, which is a tricky moment, it's true. But if you track this back, you'll see that this is an increase over time of investment in security around questions of insecurity and violence that is growing. And that year it grew by almost 7%. Right, 7% of expenditure in a particular area. That's a lot of money, right? 7% of 1.2 billion US dollars is a lot of money. That's not the kind, if you saw a kind of growth like that in terms of conditional cash transfers, attending to the positive side of human emancipation, what people can do, will be a very different set of outcomes, right? And that's not justifiable in this moment in time, right? Now, so this is a bigger sort of question, because what I want to point to here is that in development terms, in development practice terms especially, it's easier to justify expenditure in terms of security policing than it is to justify expenditure in terms of people's livelihoods, food, education, health, right? Literally the basics of human sustenance. That's a big question, right? That's a big issue. Why do we need to attend to security and policing so much, right? Couldn't we reverse a lot of these logics and place questions of health security or health education, food and sustenance, right, at a higher level than policing? And if we did, might we end up in a different kind of location, right? Why do we need to create gigantic budgets in terms of security when perhaps we could do something similar in these other logics, right? Now, here's some of these bigger questions, right? So for those who are interested in development practice, who are studying it, you'll be familiar with some of these acronyms that I have here on the left, right? So the IADB, CAF, the World Bank are big global development institutions that have historically invested in particular kinds of projects to improve development outcomes in the global south, right? Often that's been questions of privatization. We free up the market, we shrink the state a bit so we can allow for more flexibility, right? Innovation in allowing the market to play a larger role in the way that jobs can be created and livelihoods are improved, right? But in the last 20 years, what we've seen is that these institutions have started to turn. They started to turn towards questions of security and justice and their relationship to jobs, right? That people need security, or that violence is such a big problem, which has assumptions about what violence is, where it comes from, who is involved in that question, and why it originated, right? That the response must be security, policing, justice, punishment, right? And jobs associated with policing, punishment, right? So there's in this paragraph here, which is its second, this is from the overview of the Human Development Report in 2011, that explicitly links a need for expenditure that ties together citizen security, justice, and jobs, right? Which is to say, let's create jobs by spending money in justice questions and in security questions. Now, on the one hand, we might be like, okay, it's good. Yes, of course. People don't want to live in insecurity and be subject to, being robbed on the street every day, or having to be worried that, if their mother is coming home late at night, or a husband or wife, right, is out there in the city. There's doubt, right? That's a real pressing problem for people in a lot of the global South societies that we're interested in development studies. But it's a different thing to suggest that we should address those things by creating jobs deliberately associated with them, right? And let's talk about why. Let's talk about why that's a bit different, right? Okay, this is a screenshot from a report that comes from the Brazilian Development Bank. Brazilian Development Bank is a widely lauded institution created by the Brazilian government that effectively is there to finance development projects in innovative, high-risk kinds of ways. It's there to provide some space to deliberately address some really big development kinds of questions, right? These aren't necessarily questions of conditional cash transfers. This is like infrastructure projects that could be both about Brazil, but could also be about other countries around the world, right? So not limited to Brazil. But this is an interesting case in which the Brazilian state has taken it upon themselves to allow for a financing institution to address their own problems. So they're not subject to questions of, right, the World Bank and its relationship to the United States, or the IADB and its tethers to the region itself, right, and the assumptions that come along with that, right? What's the role of the United States in saying that something should be done, as opposed to what Brazil thinks should be done, right? So there's a sovereignty question here that's really important too. Now, this screenshot here is a really key indication of what I'm talking about, right? Again, it's in Portuguese, but we'll work through it here, right? So this is from a report that describes a new logic of financing that the bank is undertaking to invest in particular questions of policing and public security, right? And what they say here is they have three lines that they've invested in recently. The first is in prisons, right? So they're going to amplify the spaces and improve the conditions in prison institutions, right? And to do this, they've spent 130 million reais, right, which is a substantial amount of money. The second is to improve the public security system in the country, right? So it's an integrated program in public security with specific strategies to improve services that are provided by municipal and state public security, which is to say police institutions. In a short period of time of like 5 or 6 years, they've spent 489 million, which is around 100 million US dollars, right? Just this one development bank has done that, right, to try to attenuate this problem. And the third is investments in monitoring and intelligence. So buying up particular kinds of resources and devices and other kinds of things that would allow for police to do more diligent investigation, to solve crimes, and to actively address some of the bigger kinds of questions that surround this, right? So all of that is pretty substantial, right? It's 728 million. Brazilian reais over a short period of time, right? Now, a bigger question that emerges here is, well, if something like the Brazilian Development Bank or the World Bank or the IADB is investing in this question, these guys want a return on investment, right? They're not giving out money for free. They want to know that there's going to be some impact and some return on the money that they're getting, right? So on the one hand, straightforward, how are you going to repay the money that we give you, right? So if you're going to build prisons, we got to have some return on what you've spent to build the prison, right? How are you going to pay that back? But then in addition, what's the surplus that's created, right? So Brazilian Development Bank isn't just a lender. They're funding some of their projects by creating bonds, right? By emitting bonds that allow people to help to invest in a particular logic so that they can finance a particular set of projects or address a particular kind of problem. So that's tied up in there, right? This logic that it's not just about building prisons, but it's about building prisons that then have to make money, right? Building and amplifying police institutions that don't just go out there and resolve questions of security, but need to make money. They gotta give money back somehow, right? There has to be a way in which there's a return on what the money has been invested. Nobody gets money for free these days, right? That's pretty clear hegemonic assumption in development, right? Now, that's all really key. So how does this play out? Well, it's not just a question either of a Brazilian development bank or a different kind of sovereign wealth fund spending money to build something, right, by emitting bonds and it's private investors that come in. But the logic becomes about public-private partnerships, right? So it's the state partnering with an institution or some form of private entity to build something and to run it in a particular kind of way, right? So this here is a media release from a particular project that was created by the Brazilian Development Bank, where it articulates what's going to happen in the public-private partnership around the building of a new prison complex in one part of Brazil, in one state, right? And they say, effectively, we're going to build a new prison complex that's going to have a capacity for more than 1,000 male prisoners. And the project has the potential to be replicated elsewhere in the country. So it's going to be a best practice, right? Things we love in development. And it's going to become a reference point for others to look to as with the way that we solve these problems, right? So what they're doing here is they're saying there's a problem with the way that prison happens and the way that that's related to security itself, right? So centering the prison as a solution to insecurity and the way that policing has played a role in that, right? So to solve the problems of insecurity or of violence or of the insufficiency of policing, we can do that by building more prisons. And not only that, we can do that by building more prisons under the assumption that those prisons also will generate revenue that can pay back loans and will put money in the pockets of people who invest in them in the first place, right? Geez, some big assumptions going on here, right? So if you pare that all back and you say, well, one thing that's going on here is that in effect, we have a condition where it becomes very important that they put people in these prisons, right? If you build a prison to address something like undercapacity, poor prison conditions, right? You're not going to have a forceful argument for decreasing the number of people going into prison, right? So there's a slippery piece here in which the argument around these questions often starts with the idea that there's an overcrowding problem. That the problem of Brazilian prisons, of United States prisons, of Russian prisons, of prisons in Central America, prisons in South Africa, is that there are too many people for the number of spaces. So therefore, the problem that to be solved is the lack of space in prisons. Build more spaces, right? Build more spaces, put those people in their spaces, The problem is not the prison. The problem is the lack of prison. Make the prison bigger, right? Whew. Again, big challenge here, right? We could logically take the opposite position and say, maybe the problem isn't the lack of prison space, but it's having too many people in prison. Why are there so many people going into prison these days, right? Or why are police arresting so many people? That's another story that's going along with all of these questions. Now, many of you will already recognize that, it's not people from well-off backgrounds, well-educated in universities that are going into prisons. In Brazil, in the United States, mass incarceration is a racial problem, right? It's a problem of particular populations being policed in particular spaces, often through really extreme forms of violence, and those are the populations that end up in the prison system. So we're not even talking about building more spaces to put more people in prison. What we're actually talking about is building more spaces to put more Black, Indigenous, Hispanic people in prison, right? That's a big part of what's going on with this logic. Now, that's one side of this equation, right? Maybe we should question the solution of policing and its relationship to prison in the logics of development that matter now, and also in the way that that assumes that those things can increasingly make money for somebody or create a return, right? On the other hand, we also have a bigger question of what are the problems that are created when you put a lot of people in prison, right? It's not obvious that putting a lot of people in prison is going to solve problems of resocialization, re-education, and release into society in such a way that people come out and they're like, hey, good, I'm out. I learned my lesson. I'm a productive part of society and everything's good again, right? That's not the story. This is a graph that I've taken from some work by Ben Lessing that shows a really interesting relationship and a problem, right? That is deeply tied up with this idea of public security, policing, and prisons. What this graph shows is the incarceration rates per 100,000 residents in different countries in Latin America and California, interestingly, right? And what it shows is some different tendencies, right? California, São Paulo, El Salvador are on a similar trajectory, an increase in the number of people going into prison, right, relative to the population. So there's an active effort to police people on the streets, arrest them, put them in prison, and keep them in prison, right? And Nicaragua is diverging from that. Nicaragua is a distinctive and different kind of space, right? Now, this here is important because what it's suggesting also is he's identified a couple of key points here, right? That the blue diamond and the reddish square, purple square, and the yellow thing are moments in which organized crime groups and gangs emerged and showed themselves from within the prison system themselves, right? In California, in Brazil, and in San Salvador, different places, right? Is there a threshold here in which countries reach a certain number of people in the prison systems that we get the emergence of other forms of socialization, order, and identity within the prison systems themselves, right? That's what this is tending to show. So it isn't just a question of how do we solve the problem of public security through policing and prison, but also what happens if you put so many people in prison and don't provide for them, or don't, or that becomes the solution. Well, you get a reproducing problem of violence emerging from the prison system itself, right? Now, I'm going to end, this is my last slide, but I want to ask and return to this bigger question of policing and development, which is effectively about what about policing in the end, right? What about the policing in the end? I mean, we just emerged from a moment in Rio de Janeiro where the police went into a favela and killed 29 people. Killed 29 people in like the span of 3 hours, right? And their argument for doing that was that they were going in to dissuade minors from joining an organized crime group, right? So we're going to go in and we're going to kill a whole bunch of people, and that's going to be the symbolic act that's going to dissuade people from joining organized crime, right? policing does not typically, in practice, in the world, have a great record of solving development problems, right? And in actual fact, it's been the kind of logic that often ends up stunting the possibility for people to engage in projects of self-emancipation, right? So a reversal of these questions. What if we were to take the amount of expenditure that's given to conditional cash transfers or infrastructure or other kinds of things, which is a tiny amount of GDP, and switch it around with what we get for policing, right? If we gave 1.3% of GDP to questions of healthcare, education, social services, we would be in a very different kind of place, right? The assumption that policing and public security is the logic to solve development problems is a deeply flawed one. And whether or not we choose one side in terms of scholarship or another, this is something we need to be constantly and increasingly interrogating. I'm going to leave it from there, and I look forward to having a little discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denyer Willis. That was a very insightful and interesting presentation. And from the chat, I think we already have some really great questions. So I'll start from them right now. So our first question is from Myri. And she asks, amazing talk. Do you think the pandemic will have any societal impact? And yeah, it would be great if you can answer this.
So is that more around questions of policing and security and that sort of thing? Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very important question that is still being sorted out in its own way. My fear is that it's going to reorient and restructure the kinds of borders that matter in the world, such that we get a sense of the spaces that are safe in the world, right, that are protected, people are vaccinated, right, where it's not a problem, and we get ways in which channels between different countries in particular are enabled. But then bigger kinds of questions around places like Brazil are become really central, right, that they become understood as infectious sites, and that becomes a question itself of then policing, right, of both on the street policing, right? So like, have you been vaccinated? Are you not vaccinated, et cetera, but also in global terms. Can you go, can you flow, can you not, right? Which is already a question that's difficult in a lot of ways. So very speculative, but absolutely will have impact. It's just really a question of how.
Thank you very much. We have 3 excellent questions from Siobhan, and I will ask them individually, and then we can get through them slowly. So her first question is, you mentioned that the institution of policing as it exists today is quite new. I wonder if you could talk about what came before this. And on a related note, you spoke about how in Brazil, profit has been factoring into policing arrangements in recent times. This seems to be the trend in parts of the US as well. Why and how did this shift occur?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. Well, so this is a fascinating discussion that's happening. It's starting to happen in a more prominent way amongst those of us who are interested in policing. And in fact, the question is usually quite situated, right? So it matters in different ways. I'll give you 3 different examples. Policing, as we recognize it in institutional form, in many parts of the world, was created in the United Kingdom out of the logic of policing the Irish population, right? So there's an interesting discussion that has happened around the way that the English policed the Irish in Ireland, and that became then the incentive for how policing would happen in England during industrialization, right? So there's something important here about industry being created, urbanization, everybody coming together, labor in space, wealth in space, and the frictions between those different things. It wasn't just labor, it was also Irish labor. It was labor from Wales, from Scotland, from other kinds of places. So there were identity questions around that too. And that became really important for how policing happened in the UK. In the United States, different question. Police as the institution that we recognize them today emerged post-abolition. So police as institutions did not exist in the same bureaucratic form prior to the freedom or the emancipation of slaves, right? what happened was a kind of transmogrification of institutions that existed previous to that into policing in the kind of modern form that we talk about it today. Now, people talk about that in different ways too. So you had slave hunters, you had slave patrols, there's interesting books that talk about how that shift happened, right? It wasn't just a question of like, someone showed up and they were like, hey, the English are doing this great thing over here and we should do the same sort of thing. It was like, no, we got a social control problem here of a population that is no longer controlled in the way that it was previously. And now we need to have an understanding of how to deal with that potential problem, right? In Brazil, a similar kind of logic, except that, of course, the ideas of policing and the institutions of policing came from a different part of Europe. So there are different legal assumptions that go along with that became mixed up in the ways that the privatization of control of slaves was done by slave hunters that continued while policing started to happen. So there was a mixing in a different kind of way of the way that slaves were policed privately and by those who owned slaves and police as an institution itself, right? So looking back, right, there is a very clear, and there's tons of literature on this, very clear logic of the way that institutions, police institutions, have changed over time relative to populations that need to be controlled, right? So in England, that's a particular pattern. In the United States, it's a different kind of pattern. In Brazil, it's a different kind of pattern. And then, of course, in other locations around the world, there would be very contextual differences, right? So like Nigeria, which I don't think there's a lot of work on, outside of a couple of fairly new books, but not really well historicized, you would get very different understandings of what policing is before it becomes a kind of colonial institution, right? The second part of that question about political economy, well, this is an interesting question too, because we could say, well, hasn't that relationship also always been about making money somehow, right? That actually, I mean, the maintaining slaves, and if we are to think about police or the antecedent, the police institutions as slave patrols and things like that, that was about maintaining control over a commodity and labor that produced value and allowed you to sell cotton and export it, right, to Manchester and things like that. That was always about making money. That was about controlling the value of labor, right? Controlling the value of labor is still the same. I mean, that's the Marxist argument, is that that's been consistent over time. So the question about why now is a little bit more about, well, what is the function of the economy today? How do people make money today? Financialization, data, right? These are the modes of accumulation that are important today. So you can buy bonds and sell bonds, and they're safe money, and they're investments, and right, these are ways that people can convince others to do things in the world. So there is something important about how the political economy may be similar, may exist over time, but it takes on different forms and different shapes in different historical moments where the logic of how you make money itself changes, right? What is seen as good and how it matters does change too.
Thank you. And I think your response earlier also ties into a second question about how the legacy of colonialism has shaped policing in Latin America.
Yeah, that's great. So the similar idea, just very quickly, when people talk about the relationship between colonialism and policing, often the starting point is Ireland and England, and the boomerang effect is the idea that there is this boomerang effect, that you send the boomerang over and it comes back and it brings the knowledge and the techniques and the institution with it. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you very much. And her last question is, you spoke about how development institutions have started to appeal to questions of public security. Why is this the case? Is it simply an attempt to appeal to the preoccupations of governments, or is this shift more organic?
Excellent. Very good question. Okay, so, I mean, what I covered here was Latin America in its own specific ways, distinctive, right? And thinking in an analytical kind of way, sometimes it's important to draw these categories and think about it this way. Latin America is a highly inequitable region. It has been basically since it was founded by European colonialization. But what we've seen in terms of policing and in terms of the logics of policing, demands for policing, is a dramatic change from the 1980s until now, right? So a big question here is, well, what is it about this moment from the 1980s until now that has come to justify policing as it happens today, right? Now, some people will say, hey, that's a question of like the Washington Consensus straight up, right? You shrink the state, you shrink its expenditures, you disallow its ability to provide social services or other kinds of things. And what effectively you're doing is you're opening space for entrepreneurs. Well, yeah, you have entrepreneurs who are, authentic market actors, but you also have what some people call violent entrepreneurs, people who will exploit the uses and the spaces of deregulation in order to expand markets, to create new forms of accumulation, and things like that. So that's what some people are describing as a shaping condition for the forms of violence that have emerged in Latin America, right? That it's out of the absence of the state or the weakness of the state to provide security in a more equitable kind of way from the 1980s until now, and that itself created a crisis of insecurity across the region, right? So like nobody is discounting that Latin America, has suffered incredibly in terms of violence. I mean, spending time on the streets with homicide detectives, it's absolutely shocking and difficult to witness. The violence is an everyday part of the way that people live their lives in the region, and in other parts of the world too. But that itself then, of course, generated a particular kind of logic, right? That out of the violence that's experienced out of that historical moment, we need a response, right? And the response has been, well, how does one deal with violence, right? Well, on the one hand, we could say we're going to try to deal with violence by addressing some of the deeper and more underlying questions of who and why and where and how and when did this all start to emerge, right? Those are not the questions that are typically asked, especially when people are looking for discrete interventions and solutions that can be delivered upon and measured, right? Instead, what people have looked to are kind of tired questions of historically what has been the problem of social disorder or to crime. More prisons, more police, more authoritarian logics, right, to solve things from the top down, less democracy and who decides how this happens. And that has been the angle, right? That has been the angle over time. Now, one could also say, or blur a lot of these problems here, that this moment of, say, the Washington Consensus, deregulation, the opening up of, right, of logics of neoliberalism in Latin America and other parts of the global South created the conditions of violence itself, and then gave rise to major demands for more security, right? More policing, more crime control, more police violence, because this is a really big part of how people talk about this problem. And what's the next step? The next step is a leader who is hardline, who says, I am going to reassert order and create a society that follows the rules. And this is the way that it goes. And tradition and conservatism are the solution to this problem, right? So one could legitimately say, these institutions, the way it's happened, the solutions that have been provided by some of the rote, logics of social control have laid a foundation for people like Bolsonaro to come into power, right? And other leaders like that. These big questions of hardline leaders, of mano dura leaders and things like that are inseparable from the questions of violence that have become really important in the region, and also from the dramatic lack of expenditure around the kinds of things that actually governments should be spending money on, right? So I'll leave it at that, but I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Denyer Willis. I know we're kind of 3 minutes past the hour, but if I could just add one last question, because I'm really intrigued by your sharing, and I just wanted to build on what you said earlier about how the establishment of prisons and the system of policing are quite counterproductive to the goals of, encouraging development. So I think the UNDP has a new concept or a relatively new concept of human security. that it devised in 1994, where the essence of human security is to protect people from and to give people freedom from fear. And so I was wondering if the role of policing or prisons is inherently counterproductive to this goal of removing the use and threat of force and violence in people's lives.
Good. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, right? So it isn't for lack of thought or lack of imagination in some senses. People have tried to develop and advance new concepts like citizen security, human security, that take the individual as more the focus. What are the vulnerabilities that people are experiencing? What are the solutions that can be provided, right? And how does that all happen? I mean, I think a lot of those ideas are excellent in the ways that they map a kind of idea of what could be done, but they generally fail to advance a kind of a more holistic and feasible, right, justification for why we should be making bigger expenditures to address people's livelihoods and larger questions, right? I mean, in other words, it isn't a given that people's experiences with violence and insecurity need to be framed in those terms, right? The existence of violence in a society doesn't need to become the question of what the solution is, right? People living in contexts of violence, the solution might well be, better education, better jobs of a different variety, better ability to thrive in their own livelihoods, right? Better infrastructure. All of those things could just as well be questions of solutions. I think the human security logic does make that as an argument. It says there are larger kinds of problems here where securing the individual, providing for better welfare and assumptions is a part of that idea, but it's still framed around the idea of security, which tends to then justify a securitizing logic, which then does fit with a lot of the ideas of how we should or must respond to these problems.
Thank you very much. That was really helpful. So with that, I'll be concluding today's event. Firstly, sincere thanks to Dr. Denyer Willis for taking his time to speak to us today about such an important and interesting topic. Secondly, I would just like to remind the audience that our next talk, titled The Future of UK International Development, will be held on Thursday, 20th of May at 5 p.m. BST. So we hope to see you there. So thank you very much, Dr. Denyer Willis, and I hope you have a great day ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.